I never imagined that a single dinner invitation would cause my life to take such a drastic turn. However, the most unexpected outcomes can occasionally result from the most benign situations. I'm Rachel, and this is how a seemingly insignificant gesture completely changed my life. The Thursday night was wet. The type of cloud cover that makes it seem as though the sun has never truly risen. I tried to divert my attention from the emptiness of my own home by leafing through a stack of magazines. Financial consultant Mark, my husband, was abroad on one of his regular business travels. It was Tokyo this time. He was never home. And me? Well, I was usually here, in our exquisitely furnished but empty Chicago house. We had a good marriage. That's what I always told myself, anyway. We had friends who admired our seemingly ideal life, a lovely home, and steady jobs. However, the once unbreakable bond had weakened with time. Even when Mark was at home, his thoughts were constantly elsewhere, and we communicated more via messages and brief phone conversations than in person. In his life, I frequently felt more like a piece of decor than a romantic companion. My phone buzzed that night with a message from Mark's coworker Jonathan. At business gatherings, he was the life of the party because he was charming and outgoing. Although we had seen one other several times, our encounters had often consisted of courteous small talk over appetizers. "Hey Rachel, I hope you're doing well," the note said. "Mark is reportedly out of town. I figured you would like some company. Would you like to eat dinner with me tonight? Two pals just catching up." With my hand hovering above the keyboard, I paused. Although it seemed strange, there was nothing wrong with dining with a buddy. The idea of leaving the house was an alluring diversion from my loneliness. "That sounds good," I texted back. "Where are we supposed to meet?" Jonathan chose a small, private Italian restaurant in the heart of the city, with low lighting. I thought it was ideal for quiet chats. I changed into an understated black dress and applied makeup that was just enough to make me feel like I wasn't totally invisible. The perfume of fresh basil and garlic greeted me as soon as I walked into the restaurant. Jonathan was already there, smiling warmly and holding a bottle of red wine at a corner table. He got up and pulled out my chair as I got closer, something Mark hadn't done in a long time. He remarked, "You look stunning, Rachel," his gaze lingering a little too long. My cheeks began to flush a little. Nobody had given me that kind of look, much less uttered it in a long time. We discussed everything, including my interests that had become fleeting fancies, Mark's most recent efforts, and his job. The dialogue flowed naturally, interspersed with knowing looks and bursts of laughing. I felt a little lighter and less constrained by the unseen strings of my daily existence with every glass of wine. When I spoke, Jonathan leaned forward and listened intently, his eyes never leaving mine. Being the focus of someone's world, even for a few hours, felt too nice. He told me stories about his previous travels, his goals, and even a few subtle compliments that made me blush as the evening went on. We were comfortable with one another, a relationship that was thrilling and perilous. Then Jonathan leaned across the table and lightly touched my hand while dessert was being delivered, a rich tiramisu that we agreed to share. Even though the touch was fleeting, it hung in the air like a flame that was just waiting to ignite. "I've always admired you, Rachel," he replied quietly, his voice full of earnestness. "You're not merely Mark's spouse. You're fascinating." His meaning-laden words hovered between us. I experienced a wave of feelings that I hadn't experienced in years: fear, want, and validation. I didn't back down even though I realized this was going too far. Rather, I looked into his eyes, drawn by an unidentified force. Jonathan insisted on taking me home after we finished our dinner. The wine had weakened my determination, but I still hesitated. The talk became lighter and more lighthearted in the automobile. For a brief while, we seemed to be the only two people in the world as we joked about our mutual friends and laughed at the absurd office politics at their company. I thought the evening would end with a straightforward farewell when we got to my house. Jonathan, however, leaned in, his face inches from mine, while I unbuckled my seatbelt. For a moment, I considered pulling away as my breath stuck in my throat. However, I didn't. Softly at first, Then, with an intensity that startled us both, his lips touched mine. Something that had lain dormant for far too long began to awaken, and I felt a rush of heat. I briefly allowed myself to lose myself in it, relishing the rush of being noticed and wanted. However, reality struck me like a chilly shower. With a beating heart, I withdrew. "We can't, Jonathan. I have a spouse." "To your friend Mark." Jonathan leaned back, a puzzled look on his face. "You're right, Rachel. I am aware. However, it seemed like more than supper tonight." I nodded, a flurry of emotions racing through my head. I knew that he was correct. Dinner wasn't the only meal. It served as a reminder of all I had been without. After saying, "Maybe we should just call it a night," I opened the door and stepped outside into the cool night air. Jonathan watched me go up the stairs to my front door and nodded. Before he drove away into the night, I gave him one last look. When I woke up the following morning, the previous night's events were playing back to me like a forbidden film. I had a knot in my stomach that was a combination of confusion, guilt, and an unidentified feeling. Who would I like to speak with? My pals wouldn't comprehend, and Mark was still out of town. I kept checking my phone throughout the day, partly expecting to see a message from Jonathan. However, nothing was present. Mark's typical texts on his meetings and flying information. Everything seemed so ordinary, so typical. However, I didn't feel normal at all. I felt tense, anticipating anything that might occur. My phone eventually buzzed that night. Jonathan was the one. "Can we talk?" is a straightforward message. My thoughts were racing as I gazed at the television. The temptation was great, but I knew that answering could lead me in a direction I wasn't sure I wanted to go. "Sure," I typed back. "Come on over." Jonathan showed up at my home with a more somber expression than the previous evening. There were many unspoken words in the silence between us as we sat on the couch. The silence was finally broken by him. "I apologize for last night, Rachel." His voice was earnest as he replied, "I didn't mean to complicate things." Searching for the appropriate words, I nodded. "I understand. It's simply I didn't anticipate feeling this way." Jonathan took my hand and held it tenderly. "I don't want to ruin your relationship with Mark. However, I can't act as though nothing is here." He was disarmingly honest. I struggled to balance my commitment to Mark with my inextricable bond with Jonathan. Everything seemed both plain and puzzling at that very time. I leaned in and kissed him without thinking. It was a kiss of desperation rather than passion, a desperate attempt to feel something, anything but the numbness that had become a part of my life. With both of us panting, we withdrew. I was aware that I had gone too far and couldn't go back. The comfort was as instantaneous as the guilt. It felt like a burden I was unaware I was carrying had been removed. The days that followed were a haze of private texts and moments taken without permission. Finding reasons to get together whenever Mark wasn't around, Jonathan and I continued to see each other. The excitement of it all was intoxicating, even though I knew it was wrong. I felt alive for the first time in years. However, it was unsustainable. The falsehoods and the concealment were beginning to wear thin. I started yelling at Mark over insignificant things and ignoring his calls while Jonathan and I were together. The weight of having two lives was becoming to be too much for me to handle. Mark was waiting for me in the dark when I got home one evening after yet another late supper with Jonathan. My heart fell. His eyes were laced with distrust and hurt as he looked up. His voice was tinged with annoyance as he said, "Rachel, where have you been?" I paused, trying to think of a reason. But I was no longer able to lie. I was worn out from spinning this web of lies. I said, "I was with Jonathan," in a voice that was almost audible. Mark's look changed from one of rage to one of incredulity. "What about Jonathan?" "Jonathan, my friend." With tears in my eyes, I nodded. "Mark, I'm really sorry. I didn't intend for that to occur." With my revelation weighing heavily on his mind, Mark gazed at me. With a mixture of melancholy and rage on his face, he rose up and ran a hand through his hair. "Rachel, I trusted you. As well as him." His voice broke as he yelled, "How could you both do this?" I was at a loss for words to explain myself. I knew there was no justification that could make up for the greatest kind of betrayal I had committed against him. I believed we were all right. I assumed you were content, Mark added, his voice breaking. With tears running down my cheeks, I gazed at him. I felt content. I was lonely, though. Mark, you're constantly away. Additionally, somewhere along the way, I lost myself. Mark turned away from me and shook his head. Rachel, this is about more than just me. You made a decision that harmed us both. We remained silent as the truth of our failed marriage descended upon us like a dense mist. I wanted to get in touch with him to mend the damage I had caused, but I realized it wouldn't be that easy. The weeks that followed were long, silent nights and heated discussions. Although the trust had been irreparably harmed, Mark and I attempted to restore what was remained of our marriage. We attempted to repair and attended counseling, but it felt like we were merely following the rules. After that night, Jonathan and I broke up right away. I couldn't look at him the same way even after he apologized. He served as a reminder of my errors and the decisions that brought me to this point. I had to break with the past in order to rediscover who I was. Eventually, Mark and I made the decision to part ways. Although it was an unpleasant choice, it was also essential. Both of us required time to recover and discover our identities apart. I experienced a strange mixture of relief and melancholy as I packed up my belongings and moved into a little apartment downtown. I was left to pick up the pieces when my life took unexpected turns. Life can lead us in unexpected directions at times. I never intended to do harm to anyone, least of all my spouse. But I lost sight of what I already had in my quest for more. It's simple to become engrossed in the excitement of the present and overlook the repercussions. But if my story can remind you of anything, it should be to be grateful for what you have. Be truthful with yourself as well as with other people, because a short moment can sometimes cost far more than you could have ever anticipated.